I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT. And we are thrilled to be part of Intel's launch of their third generation Xeon Scalable processors, codename Ice Lake. We just watched Intel's keynote where CEO Pat Gelsinger and then EVPs Navin Shenoy and Lisa Spellman presented the market for these new processors and, more importantly, the market for the platform that they represent. Now I'd like to kind of turn to the delegates and ask them what they thought of the launch and of the market. But first, to provide some context, we have Tim Crawford, who really, I think, understands the market that these processors and this processor platform fall into. So, Tim, I'd like you to kick off the demonstration or the discussion with just a little bit of background. Who's watching and what are they looking for from Intel today?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and glad to take part in the discussion this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you might be joining us from. The presentation by Intel, I found to be really interesting on a number of different facets. First and foremost, when you think about customers, and the customers for Intel are secondary and tertiary. So you have the cloud service providers, you have the OEMs, but then you have the end users, the enterprises that are consuming these products. And one of the things that I found really interesting from this Ice Lake launch is that they really brought those stories to the forefront. They really talked about how customers at each stage are using the products and applying the products and how they're differentiating on those products. And so, whereas in the past, we might have been focused more on speeds and feeds or percentage improvements, which there was some in the presentation, there was definitely an emphasis on what customers are trying to do and how these different products kind of fit into that. And so I think that's first and foremost the big thing. The second thing that I would say, and I know we're going to get into this in more detail, is edge to cloud. One of the strengths of Intel from the get-go has really been the breadth of their portfolio. And when you think about what enterprises are doing, they're having to contend with this edge to cloud continuum. And so I think it's important that we kind of delve into that a little further too and how it plays out. But Stephen, kind of on the top line, I would say it's really customer focused. And I was really encouraged to see that, especially in light of the alternatives that are in the market today.
Thanks a lot, Tim. And I absolutely agree. If there's one way that I would sum up the keynotes today was that it was all about customers and use cases and how these platforms are affecting applications in business, in the cloud, not about bits and bytes and speeds and feeds and cores and channels and so on. How about some of the rest of you? How does this affect you? Maybe Frederick, I mean, you've kind of have a similar position in the market, or Bruno?
Yeah, I do think that Intel's message is really resonates well with new applications, right? I typically, the way I explain it to people is evolutionary versus revolutionary. And evolutionary is you have an application and you have a tendency to replace a component with a faster component, more cores, more speedier. The reality is that applications and also application design have changed significantly. There used to be a time where application development was so costly that hardware was really thrown at the problem. And when people wanted more performance, more bandwidth, they would just say, buy more hardware. I think those days are over. And a company like Intel is realizing that the application is really king nowadays. There is no need to go much faster. There is a need for a high level of parallelization. And there's also a need for integrating new innovation like AI into their framework. Now, how does that work? I mean, it used to be, let's call it CPU intensive if you want, or CPU centric versus data centric. In a data centric world, the processing component is just a fraction of what you need. You need to have an end-to-end solution. It's really the slowest component that will drag you down. And I agree with Tim there. I think the presentation from Intel is a nice reflection of all those individual components. And the messaging is also towards the the new application builders saying, you don't have to rely just on the CPUs for the fastest thing ever. You have to focus on all the different components, and it will be a good challenge also for application developers to change how the way they develop applications, because that's also not necessarily an easy way to do it. And I think on the side, Intel also has brought up a couple of times the focus on software, right? So having the hardware to do all the work, but not having enough software in order to achieve your goals also is kind of a challenge. So I think in general, I like the message. It's a defocus from the traditional, the CPU is king, and more focus on others. So I hope that message resonates with other people as well.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said there, Frederick. I think the reason the application is king is because everything has to relate to business requirements. It's no longer speeds and feeds that are going to sell boxes and solve problems. CIOs' eyes glaze over when they hear about processor speeds and memory speeds and things like that. So if Intel can tell the story of how their platforms support the applications, which eventually make the business successful, that's really what's going to make them a front runner or keep them as a front runner in the marketplace here.
I'd like to say something from my point of view, which is the point of view of end user, consumer of their solution and customer. Today, I really heard something that as a customer, I wanted to hear from them. The story really resonated with me. Again, as a customer, the image of Intel in the last couple of years, in a way, it has been tainted somehow with all the Spectrum meltdown things, with the competition which was very aggressive from other vendors, with sometimes with a confusing message coming with different different product presentations that were not that coherent between each other. Today it was totally different. I kind of felt that the ship changed the direction in a good way, and I could hear something that gave me the feeling of things that as a customer I can do with their whole portfolio of solution. Very, very coherent, very well integrated, with a lot of potential.
I wonder if it's worth zooming out a little bit, because I think not only is this an Intel presentation and an Intel's launch, but as we've talked about, right, they're kind of launching into this market. And one of the things Navin Shenoy at the beginning, he talked about kind of these four big trends, which I think are the trends that we hear a lot of vendors talking about. And I just wanted to kind of maybe get a temperature check or a gut check from this group is cloud, AI, mobile, and edge. Are those really the big enterprise trends that vendors are saying they are, or are these things that are really vendor driven, right? I mean, I'm wondering if these are supply or demand trends. Is this stuff that is another reason to sell gear, or are these actual enabling technologies that are really being used, and to what degree?
Yeah, I think it's what I said earlier as far as applications. I mean, if you see AI, there's a lot more AI application development being done, and I know for a fact that Intel has been working behind the scenes to optimize and adjust their processors for applications. So an example of that is 2 or 3 years ago, Intel was collecting a lot of data on how and which instruction sets were being used in applications, and then they started to adapt their CPUs such that those instruction sets would be fully optimized. So I do think that Intel is adjusting to the market. I'm not, there might be areas where they're pushing, but I do believe that they're really following the market and see where the trends are happening, and then try to accommodate for those.
And that's what I liked as well, is that it's looking at what we saw an hour ago or something like that, is that we really saw something that gave us the opportunity as a customer to look at it from a perspective of what we have in our own data centers and leveraging that with the cloud data centers as well. So they brought a story that we can have their technologies on premises, at the edge, or wherever, but still leverage it from both sides of the coin, to put it that way. So that's what I really liked about this as well.
And I also think it's not that much important to have a specific CPU or specific details of a CPU in your server running, because they are more or less exchangeable. So all of them somehow deliver what you need. So the differentiation will be for the application and for the industry market.
On that point, yeah, I think that a lot of people, myself included, were really keen on seeing some of the, the speeds and feeds, the core numbers, the, PCIe lanes and stuff like that. But really, truly, all Intel needs from Ice Lake is a competitive server CPU for the majority of applications. And, it seems like they've got that now. It seems like that's what they're delivering. And from there, then, they can talk about the bigger picture of applications and platforms. Is that right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they needed a workhorse that could compete roughly with the GPUs of the world, right? So think high level of parallelization with the ability to process as much data as you can in a certain amount of time. And it's not their first attempt, right? They tried with Xeon Phi in the past, where they learned from it, so they kind of went to the FPGA route, which is a successful route. But I do think that they needed something on the heavier side as a workhorse, and I think that's what this is bringing to the table.
Yeah, I would just add to that what Frederick was outlining is I look at it as two components that they had to bring to the table. One is kind of a reassurance, right? We've talked a lot about the manufacturing challenges that they've had over the last couple of years. So, they were subtle about it, but I'm glad that they are kind of addressing that and not just sweeping it under the carpet, because that's a big deal for CSPs, OEMs, and end users. Where do I kind of place my bets? But I think the second piece is they really had to start creating that connective tissue between the products and the portfolio, as well as the applications and the use cases. So just talking about, hey, we've got a processor for cloud, or we have components that work with cloud, or we have a solution for AI, and here's how it compares against the alternative solutions. I don't think that's enough. I think you really have to have a compelling story that talks about how this technology is going to connect the dots to some type of outcome. And that outcome is a business outcome. It's not a technology outcome. And so I think in the Ice Lake launch, we saw where Intel is starting to kind of turn the ship in that direction, and that will serve them well going forward.
And it's really that whole that platform story that a couple of you have mentioned. It's their processors, it's their hard drives, it's the memory, it's the network adapters. They can really tell us the whole story here and fill in those. Create those positive business outcomes across their entire platform here, not just a niche player in one or two of those. And we saw that with their announcements around their collaboration with cloud entities, 5G installations, artificial intelligence, various business silos like that. Business verticals, I guess.
I wonder if after today's presentation, we can already see the touch of Pat Gelsinger coming back as CEO. I mean, the style is kind of tried and tested with VMware, which had a similar approach during the keynotes at their conferences in the past year. So I can find some similarities already. So I don't know, maybe Pat has been on the job for a short time, but maybe he managed to bring this kind of positive approach to the messaging and the communication and to the storytelling.
Right. There were two other things that I was going to highlight as part of this too, which is, they did talk about the developer right at the end and kind of engaging the developer into the sequence. And it would have been great to hear more about how they're doing that. I think the on event coming up in October will be helpful and provide some guidance there, but I'd really like to see them kind of explore that a little further. The second piece, and this is a component that I've seen for quite a while, but isn't well understood publicly, is the amount of software that Intel creates is just phenomenal. But they're really not doing a great job of getting that out and creating that connective tissue with it. And so I would have liked to have heard a lot more about One API. I know they've already announced it. They've talked a lot about One API in the past. But I think when you're talking about something like the Ice Lake launch, you have to make sure that you're weaving it into the conversation as part of that core connective tissue, not an add-on after the fact. And I kind of felt like One API was just kind of something that they thought, okay, you know, we should probably make a mention of it at some point. And so that was a little disappointing, because I think that actually will be something that will drive enterprise use and CSP use of the portfolio edge to cloud over time, especially as you start thinking about higher level functions like SGX and enclaves and the rest.
Could that be a sign? I'm sorry. Could that be a sign of the new messaging, that we're seeing some of the former stuff set aside? I mean, could this be Pat's hands on it already?
It could be. I honestly think that, you know, Pat hasn't been there long enough to truly make as significant of a change that he probably will be making, but we're probably seeing some of his fingerprints in here at this early stage, and we'll probably see more of them in time to come.
Yeah, I want to underline that idea of the importance of software and how much software Intel's really building, but not talking about. And I think, Tim, I think you're exactly right that, you know, through most of at least the main presentation, right, One API, it wasn't quite a throwaway comment, but it was kind of tagged on. I think the first time that I heard it really explained, at least today in today's launch, was in one of the breakout sessions we listened to. I believe it was the HPC breakout actually, where she talked about, you know, why One API really mattered and how it allows you to kind of build software against kind of all of Intel's, you know, portfolio of chipsets. And I think that is really, really powerful. I know that, you know, especially in the AI space, but I think in other software development as well, that's a big theme right now of a lot of little startup companies that are really just trying to build software or glueware or whatever you want to call it to make these things easier, right? To make it easier to develop AI applications, to make it easier to develop IoT applications, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that list just kind of keeps going. And Intel's already doing a lot of this. So I just want to really kind of highlight what Tim just said and say that that's definitely something Intel could do a better job of talking about in a launch like this. Even though it is about the hardware and the new hardware launch, I think they could have spent a bit more time supporting that with how you use this entire architecture across your enterprise.
I think we've seen the same with the storage people as well with Deos. I think it was mentioned as well, and it's also one of those things that's really on the software side of Intel, but it seems Intel is really focused right now on the hardware side, not on the software side.
Yeah, but I think it's just a messaging piece because they build compilers. They have been building compilers for a very long time. They have been providing AI components before we call them AI, you know, math libraries and so on. They also are contributing to a lot of the AI frameworks today. So I do think it is indeed a messaging component. Me personally, I think I always looked at them as a processor company and maybe doing some networking and other stuff on the side. I think right now I'm changing my mind in the sense that from a hardware perspective, they seem to have a fluent message, you know, call it an ecosystem if you want. I do think they understand they have a lot of software. I just don't think messaging wise, they're ready for that. And maybe Pat will be the one that kind of glues everything together. But, you know, having done research for years, we all know Intel has been and still is supplying a lot of the IP for all the frameworks that are being delivered today. So,
I think the answer there is that software is more of an enabler for the hardware, not a product per se. And I think that maybe it's not surprising then that they wouldn't lead with software. because software is basically what's paving the path. But I ran out of my metaphor, but the point is that the hardware is the thing that they're really trying to sell.
Right.
And that was the comment I was going to make, Stephen, is, what comes first? When you talk about the horse and the cart, does hardware sell software? Does software sell hardware? I can remember back kind of to Frederick's earlier comment, many moons ago, Intel came out with this newfangled processor called the Pentium. And it required a very unique special compiler to be able to compile your code for that Pentium processor. This is the first generation Pentium. And I worked with a little company at the time, not well known, to understand what that process was like. And it was all about the software, and it was all about the compiler. The hardware was almost kind of a consequence to the side. And that little company that was one of the early adopters of that was called Pixar. And it was fascinating. But even back then, that goes back many moons, the focus was the software and the outcome. And we've kind of lost our connection with that. And I think this launch is showing that Intel is starting to truly take it seriously and remake that connection. They've been doing it behind the scenes, but they haven't been coming out and putting it front and center in their launches. And so I think this is a huge shift for them, which will be good.
Well, I'd like to wrap up a little bit here on the overall marketing and messaging roundtable. Is there anyone that wants to get a final message in?
I have one quick thing, and that's they seem to a thread of security seemed to be laced throughout their entire presentation. They talked about security a lot with the new threats, even specifically around, the pandemic, people being taken advantage of and things like that. They weaved security and built in crypto in their CPUs, in the memory and things like that. So it's, they've put in security without making the performance suffer as well. So that wasn't lost on me.
But using security is always a thing of the software as well, right? So just the security features in hardware won't be enough. So you need some vendors, some suppliers for software which use those features.
I'd say that overall, from kind of stepping back and looking at this launch, I think that Intel really did a marvelous job of basically focusing on the differentiators for Intel and the differentiators that this new chip and the surrounding ecosystem components bring to the platform and bring to their customers, without making it a bits and bytes fest or there's not demos, there's not all this stuff that we're used to seeing at chip introductions, not even a lot of benchmark numbers. Essentially, Intel came out and said, we've got a competitive platform. It's something new. It enables a lot of great applications. It's part of a overall server platform. And this is what it can do for businesses. This is what it can do for markets. And for me, that was really the big takeaway from today's launch. In a way, it's not surprising that we didn't call it, the Ice Lake launch or something. We called it, how wonderful gets done. Because I think that that's really what they're focused on. And it was also extremely nice to see, Pat Gelsinger out there. Again, I'll call out as well. I personally really enjoyed seeing all the other CEOs congratulating him and welcoming him to probably their most important hardware partner. And, that speaks a lot to see folks from HPE and Dell and Cisco and the cloud providers out there congratulating him. So we can't wait to see what you do in the future, Pat. Intel, nice job overall on the messaging and the positioning of today's launch. And the next roundtable is going to focus more on the bits and bytes of what was announced.